The Widow's Inheritance. Welcome back, a tale of inheritance, silence, and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed, but the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe, and share. The record begins property of the Georgia Historical Society, Burke County Folios. Item, Thornhill Estate Papers, Box 7, condition, mold damage, fragments only. Access restricted. Special collections, Savannah, GA. The first entry is not a letter nor a confession, but a fragment, a Union report from April 1864. A barn near Waynesboro burned to ash. Within the cellar of the adjacent house, 23 children, gaunt, silent, unnervingly uniform, were found locked behind iron. Their captors had fled, the mistress vanished. The Union officer's memorandum was stamped for official eyes only, and later redacted, but even mutilated documents leak truths. We begin in Burke County, Georgia, the year 1847, when Jonathan Thornhill breathed his last. Jonathan Thornhill's fall. Jonathan was no patriarch, only a hollow name. He drank, he gambled, and in his final months seemed to wilt like Cain left to rot in the field. His debts festered. The Thornhill plantation was 1,700 acres in size, but ran lean, fields untended, ledgers steeped in red. On a damp November night he expired, leaving only a widow and a 16-year-old son. The widow was Catherine Danforth Thornhill, daughter of a wealthy Augusta merchant. She wept, as was expected, but not with despair. To her father she wrote a brief note, more ledger than lament. Father, Jonathan has departed. The land is mine entire. With prudent hand I shall make it fruitful. Danforth Family Correspondence, Box 3, Fall. 19. Augusta Historical Sock. The son, Richard Thornhill, saw matters differently. He had grown up on the failing estate and knew the weight of debt. Rumors of creditors circled the house. In his own hand survives one page. She speaks of cultivation, but her eyes are not fixed upon cotton nor corn. Something else turns in her mind, a design I dare not name. A private diary of R. Thornhill, recovered fragment 1847. The widow's resolve with Jonathan buried. Catherine assumed the estate. She was only 28, young for a widow, shrewd for a mistress. She summoned Ambrose Talbot, family lawyer, and pressed him for inventories. He brought ledgers, foreclosure threats, lists of enslaved property, debts owed to Danforth merchants in Augusta. Talbot later testified in an 1889 deposition taken decades after. The widow spoke in calm, deliberate tones. She declared that the estate would not perish. She said she possessed a plan. I inquired no further, fearing the answer. Her plan, of course, was not agricultural. Catherine believed the Thornhill name itself was withering, decayed by Jonathan's weakness. She conceived instead a restoration of blood, a program of calculated breeding, selection, and cultivation, not of crops but of flesh. She began keeping a ciphered journal, its pages sealed with coded script, mixtures of Latin, Greek letters, and private symbols. Marginal notes, later deciphered by her daughter Elenina, reveal her phrasing: bloodroot, foundation, grafting, perfection of stock. Richard's suspicion, Richard, Jonathan's son, lingered in the household. 16, sickly, pale as parchment, he carried himself with suspicion. He knew Catherine despised him, not her blood, only a remainder of Jonathan's waste. When he came across the journal, left unattended upon her desk, he recognized neither language nor cipher, but felt the weight of its secrecy. He confided in a servant, Pearl, to whom he entrusted a letter meant for Ambrose Talbot. Pearl betrayed him, passing the folded page directly into Catherine's hands. That evening, Catherine smiled over supper. She ladled soup into Richard's bowl and urged him to eat. Within weeks, his body began to decline. Pallor deepened, vomiting worsened, night sweats chilled him. Parish records mark his burial. Deck, 17, 1008, 147, interred Richard Thornhill, age 16, consumption. Westboro Parish Register, Burke Co. Yet physicians whispered his illness came sudden, without precedent. Catherine inherited all. The first birth before winter's end, Catherine herself took to confinement, with Miriam Grayson, the midwife, attending. She bore a child, Jonathan Thornhill Jr., in late December of 1847. Grayson's account survives in a ledger of medical cases: delivery difficult, instruments required, forceps, calipers, healthy male, vigorous. Widow speaks of him as new branch grafted to the tree. Case notes M. Grayson, Burke Co., medical call. MS-12, the child's arrival marked the true beginning of what Catherine later named the program. To her, Jonathan Jr. was not a son but a seed, the first in a line she intended to craft. The first rootstock, with Richard buried and her womb already proven fertile, Catherine looked outward. She selected among the enslaved for men of stature, strength, symmetry. One in particular, Isaac, was chosen as her initial rootstock. Catherine recorded measurements in her ciphered hand: chest breadth, limb proportion, cranial circumference measured with calipers, marginal note, sound structure, firm in temper, blood to be grafted. But Isaac's fate was not long upon the estate. In 1849 he was sold south, perhaps too unruly, perhaps unwilling to bend. Yet Catherine had set the precedent. She believed herself surgeon of lineage, midwife of destiny, cultivator of perfection. The widow's mask to the community of Westborough and Waynesborough, she remained a grieving widow, pious, charitable, a woman restoring her household after her husband's mismanagement. She made appearances at church, spoke kindly to neighbors, wrote her father dutiful reports. But within Thornhill walls she laid foundation for horrors. She recorded hair samples from infants, pressed them into folios with date and parentage. She filed her ciphered charts in a locked trunk, kept in what she called the heritage room. Ominous foreshadow, the first part of our account ends here. Richard in his grave, Catherine in possession, the first child born, the first measurements taken. Yet already the outlines of the future are inscribed. A Union officer's redacted report, written 17 years later, seems almost prophetic in retrospect. The children we discovered bore a likeness most unnatural, as though one mold had cast them all. Their mistress had fled, yet her presence lingered in the very air. One boy spoke for them, his voice measured, unchildlike. I find my sleep disturbed since, and I pray this report never sees circulation. Lt. James H. Lowell, Union Army, suppressed letter, April 1008, 164. What began as a widow's inheritance had already become something darker. A design for blood and silence, carried forward by forceps, ledger, and laudanum. The breeding ground welcome watchers in the dark. What you hear tonight was not meant for ears nor meant for paper. These fragments were smothered, burned, and buried, yet they persist in charred folios and whispered depositions. Before we press on into Catherine Thornhill's designs, steady yourself, and if you have not already, subscribe, and let the record of silence spread. From a deposition, 1887, I delivered her children myself. I saw her journals, though not with my eyes upon the script, for the writing was in cipher, but I saw how she guarded them. She spoke of her sons and daughters not as children, but as foundations, as branches. I did what I was told. My silence, she gave me coin, a cottage, food enough. I cannot wash my hands of it now, though they buried her long ago. Miriam Grayson, midwife, sworn testimony, Augusta Ga, 1887. The widow ascended between 1848 and 1853. The Thornhill estate began to change. To neighbors, it was a modest improvement. Fields no longer fallow, debts slowly eased. To the enslaved, it was an iron tightening, a new regime far worse than Jonathan Thornhill's careless misrule. Catherine bore 4 more children in those years: Eleanor 1849, Abigail 1850, Margaret 1852, and Samuel 1853. Each father was chosen deliberately. Catherine's criteria were brutal in their precision: stature, strength, teeth, eyes, no stammering, no limps. Character, spirit, or family ties meant nothing. The midwife Grayson attended every confinement, and for her obedience she was rewarded with a cottage near the edge of the estate. She became more than a midwife. She was enforcer, accomplice, custodian of secrets. Abortions in the quarters, whispers grew among the enslaved women. Some pregnancies were welcomed, others dreaded, for Catherine intended no random birth, only those she had sanctioned. When unions occurred beyond her designs, when a woman lay with a man of her choosing, not Catherine's, Grayson was summoned. In her ledger, surviving only in fragments now charred at the edges, Grayson noted, decoction administered, bleeding commenced within the hour, mistress satisfied. The women did not speak of it openly, but silence weighs heavier than words. They bled in secret, grieved in secret. One woman, Ruth, could not submit so quietly. Ruth was strong, 20 years old in 1851, carrying a child fathered by Samuel, a field hand her own age. They had chosen each other without Catherine's sanction. When Catherine discovered it, she ordered immediate termination. Ruth fled, desperate, carrying the child inside her into the pine forests. For nearly a day she was free, until the overseer's dogs tore through the underbrush and brought her down. Witnesses recalled her screams carried back into the estate yard. 2 men held her down as Grayson poured the bitter draught into her mouth, pinching her nose to force swallowing. The convulsions lasted an hour. The child was gone by dawn. Ruth survived, but something inside her broke. For 2 years she worked in silence, eyes hollow, voice absent, until a fever carried her away at 24. Her name appears once in Catherine's coded journal, uncooperative stock, eliminated. Isaac's disappearance by 1849. Isaac, the first rootstock Catherine measured and chose, was gone. Sold to Alabama, the records say, for $800. Officially, the sale helped ease Thornhill's debts. Unofficially, Isaac had become inconvenient, knowing too much of Catherine's design, speaking too loudly of what he saw. The enslaved whispered that Catherine had bled him out of the estate the way one prunes a tree limb. His departure marked a warning to others. Compliance meant survival, refusal meant sale or worse. Thomas and Hannah in 1855, Catherine selected another. Thomas, a field hand in his 20s, broad-shouldered, resilient. He was married to Hannah, who was carrying their first child. When he resisted being taken to the main house, Overseer Virgil Kane lashed him 39 times in front of all. His back never healed smooth. After the whipping, Catherine summoned him anyway. He complied, silent, staring past her. The next day he returned to the quarters. Hannah never asked what occurred in the house, and Thomas never told. But she saw the scar upon his back, the way his hands shook when he held her. In Catherine's ledger, Thomas optimal musculature, bloodline secured, compliance reinforced. The plantation's quiet transformation by 1853, Thornhill had begun to look healthy again. The fields grew thick with cotton. The ledger books balanced. Catherine's reputation rose as a woman of fortitude, a widow managing land with rare skill. But the estate itself was reshaped by her logic. There were 3 categories of life upon the land now. The field hands, ordinary enslaved laborers, worked by Virgil Kane. The house servants, 4 in number, bound close to Catherine's immediate service. The special children, Catherine's brood, by her chosen sires, raised within the house, fed and clothed above the others. These children were told they were orphans, rescued by Catherine's charity. They learned letters at her knee, dangerous knowledge in a land where teaching the enslaved to read was a crime. The others, the true enslaved, watched with horror and pity. They saw what these children represented, not freedom, but a new bondage written in blood. Silence from the lawyer. Ambrose Talbert, the family lawyer, might have asked questions. He might have counted dates and births, might have seen through Catherine's claim that these were orphan dependents. But Thornhill was paying its debts again. Cotton flowed. Talbert's fees were steady. In a marginalia note found in his 1853 ledger, Mrs. Thornhill prudent, profitable, questions unnecessary. It was profit that silenced him, profit and the isolation of Thornhill, miles from town, where no neighbor looked too closely. Echoes of resistance. The enslaved community carried their grief in whispers. Some prayed over the graves of lost children. Some whispered that Ruth's ghost walked the pine ridge at night, her dress soaked in blood, cradling what was taken from her. Yet none spoke openly. To resist was to be lashed, to be sold, or to die. The silence itself became a kind of cage. Foreshadow of storm by 1853, Catherine's journals already spoke of generations. She had charts inked across whole pages. Eleanor X. Isaac's son predicted vigor, Abigail X. Thomas's line endurance, Margaret X. Samuel's nephew docility. She drew her family trees like breeding manuals, lines crossing, branches grafting. She spoke aloud sometimes to Grayson, "I am planting for the century, a workforce no one can steal, for it is mine in Marrow." But outside Thornhill, storm clouds were gathering. The compromise of 1850 had stirred tempers. Kansas was bleeding. Men in courthouse squares spoke of Union fracture. Catherine paid it no mind. Her war was already underway, not in politics, but in bloodlines. By 1853, the Thornhill estate was outwardly restored, but inwardly damned. Ruth lay buried. Isaac was gone. Thomas bore scars. The special children grew in silence, never told who their fathers were. And Catherine's journals filled with plans not for crops or markets, but for generations of flesh yet unborn. What grew at Thornhill was not prosperity, but a garden of bodies cultivated by one woman's will, fertilized with secrecy and grief. The heritage room, what follows, lies between ledger fragments and a survivor's half-spoken memory. The walls of Thornhill kept their silence, but paper does not rot fast enough to bury everything. Listen closely, and remember, subscribe if you dare, for there are more pages yet to turn, and each darker than the last. From an anonymous letter, 1891, I was taken once into a chamber beneath Thornhill's east wing, a place the mistress called her heritage room. There were shelves of jars, locks of hair, clipped fingernails, swatches of cloth stiff with dried blood. Above the shelves were charts pinned to plaster, branches and names scrawled in a cipher I could not read. She touched them with a tenderness a mother reserves for her child. I left with my skin crawling, for I knew then it was not land or cotton she hoped to preserve, but a lineage of her own devising, adolescence of the chosen. By 1856, the children Catherine had selected were growing older, some reaching 8 or 9, others near their early teens. To outsiders, they were orphans, wards of her charity, given lessons in letters and numbers, groomed for respectable futures. But within the walls of Thornhill they were not wards, they were specimens. Catherine fed them selectively, measured their limbs as they grew, tracked their teeth, eyesight, and skin. Miriam Grayson recorded their heights every month in a private ledger. At night, Catherine whispered to them tales of destiny. "You are not like the others. You are foundation stones. Your veins carry something meant to last." The children did not fully understand, but they carried the burden in their posture, their gaze. The hidden chamber around this time, renovations were made in Thornhill's east wing. A storeroom once used for barrels of salt pork and tools was emptied, reinforced with brick and fitted with heavy shelves. Here Catherine created what later accounts call the heritage room. She collected everything, strands of hair from combs, fingernail clippings, rags stained with menstrual blood, milk teeth shed by children, even bones from infants who had not survived birth. Each was placed in jars or bundles, labeled with ciphers no one but Catherine and Grayson could read. At the center stood a great board, an enormous hand-drawn chart of crossings and branches. Catherine traced them with her finger, muttering to herself about strength meeting endurance, docility folding into vigor. It was a shrine, but not to God. It was a shrine to her vision. Miriam Grayson's role Grayson was no longer merely midwife. She was archivist, guardian of the heritage room. Some later said she stayed silent because she feared for her life. Others argued greed, or that she was herself ensnared by Catherine's charisma. Her testimony decades later hinted at shame. "I knew the line between duty and sin, but it blurred so easy. She paid me, she trusted me, and I wanted to believe a woman could build something lasting without men, but the way of it was crueler than I ever let myself admit." Whether willing accomplice or reluctant prisoner, she held the keys to the chamber and her hands arranged the jars. The enslaved community's silence, the enslaved spoke little of the chamber, but they felt its shadow. Mothers whispered that their children's hair, once brushed, vanished, that scraps of cloth from their laundry never returned. They said Ruth's ghost, the woman forced to abort years earlier, was bound into that room. That her moans could be heard when the jars rattled in the night, when storms swept across the estate. No one dared resist openly, but silence had teeth. Mothers held their children tighter. Men lowered their eyes when Catherine passed. And the sense grew. Thornhill was no longer a plantation. It was a crypt of the living. The children divided by 1,858 lines had sharpened between these special children, and the ordinary enslaved. The chosen ones wore cleaner clothes, slept under roofs, spoke in a tongue taught by books. Some looked with pity upon the field hands, others looked with quiet disdain, believing themselves born of better stock. One boy, Samuel, born 1,853, once asked aloud at table, "Why do they not learn letters too?" Catherine's smile chilled Grayson, who recalled it later. "Because, child, some are meant to follow and others to lead, and you must never forget which you are." Thus the chosen grew into adolescence, bearing the brand not of chains but of purpose, yet both weighed heavy. Whisper of politics beyond outside Thornhill, the nation shuddered. The Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854 had spilled blood on prairie fields. Newspapers carried word of men shot, houses burned, John Brown's name whispered like a curse. But Catherine read no newspapers, or rather, she skimmed them for reports of markets, not of war. When neighbors spoke of abolitionists and secessionists, she merely said, "Let them quarrel, my work is here." She built her fortress in flesh and blood, not in votes or laws. A child's fracture in 1859, Margaret, Catherine's daughter by one of the chosen pairings, began to wither. At 7 years old, she grew pale, complained of aches in her bones. Catherine ordered remedies, tonics, bleeding. Nothing eased her decline. In the heritage room, one jar still bears her name, a lock of blonde hair sealed in resin. In Catherine's cipher, branch cut short, fault in Marrow, must be corrected in future unions. Margaret died before her 8th birthday. The enslaved mothers said it was God's justice. Catherine said nothing. She simply placed the child's remains into the earth and her hair into a jar. Tension at the edges by 1859. The enslaved community at Thornhill had been hollowed by fear. Stories of Ruth, Isaac, and now Margaret's ghost circulated in murmurs at night. Some said the air in the quarters was heavy, that babies cried with no cause, that dogs barked at the east wing with hackles raised. Overseer Kane laughed at such tales, but even he grew uneasy, for he claimed to hear scratching within the walls near the heritage room. The truth, perhaps, was worse than ghosts. The scratching was mice gnawing at bundles of hair, disturbed by the unnatural collection. Yet the symbolism lingered. The dead were restless in Thornhill's walls, foreshadow of catastrophe as 1859 closed. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry sent panic through Virginia and Georgia alike. Neighbors drilled militias, feared uprisings. Thornhill's enslaved watched quietly, but no spark reached them. Catherine's control was too suffocating. Yet her journals show unease. The country trembles. Blood rises like a tide. If the Union splits, will my lineage hold? The work must hasten. And so she pressed on, accelerating pairings, tightening the heritage room's records, convinced that her garden of flesh would outlast whatever storms came. By the eve of the 1860s, Thornhill had become less a plantation than a hidden laboratory of blood. The chosen children reached adolescence under Catherine's gaze. The enslaved sank into silence, and the heritage room, with its jars and charts, grew into a grotesque archive of human lives reduced to specimens. Storms brewed beyond the plantation, the Union trembling, abolitionists rising. But within Thornhill the storm was already rooted in flesh. Blood in the ground. The year was 1860, a hinge in history. The country broke itself upon ballots and bayonets, yet within Thornhill the fracture was older, deeper, and cut not through states but through flesh. Here is what the records whisper. While a nation dissolved, Catherine Thornhill built her empire of marrow and womb. Listen and tread carefully. Some of these pages were not meant for daylight. The outside world, the plantation journal of a neighboring planter, Elias Fordham, notes in the winter of 1860, talk at Westboro is all secession and Lincoln. Neighbors drill in secret, wives stock salt and powder. Yet Mistress Thornhill sits apart. She speaks little of war, less of politics. When asked, she only smiles and says, "Let them quarrel. Blood must flow one way or another." In Burke County taverns, secession was shouted over whiskey. But in the candle-lit corridors of Thornhill, Catherine's war was quieter, written not in votes but in genealogical charts, etched with quill and sealed in jars. Pairings and second generation by 1860, her eldest, Jonathan Thornhill Jr., stood near manhood. Catherine arranged his coupling with Rachel, one of the younger women born of earlier enforced unions. The ceremony bore no altar or vows, only Catherine's whispered directive, a candle guttering in the heritage room. "The blood must circle back, Jonathan. She carries strength you must preserve." Jonathan did not resist, yet the journals suggest his compliance bore unease. He wrote in a margin once, half effaced by later water damage, "I do as she asks, but my dreams burn with guilt. Rachel's eyes accuse me in silence." Other pairings followed. Samuel was marked for Anna. Caroline was reserved for a cousin branch. All entered Catherine's chart like livestock tallied for breeding. The enslaved grow restless among the quarters. A different ledger was whispered. Women remembered Ruth's cries, Sarah's wasted body, Margaret's little coffin. They told stories of Haints roaming the east wing, of jars rattling at night as if souls clawed to escape. Hope, the enslaved woman who would later play a decisive role in Catherine's fall, was already muttering resistance. An oral account, passed down through her granddaughter, recalls, "Mrs. thought herself God. We knew better. We kept still, but we kept count." Every vanished child, every broken mother, every whipping at Cain's hands, they were etched into a memory sharper than any pen. Overseer Cain's departure, Virgil Cain, the brutal overseer, enlisted when Georgia seceded in early 1861. Whether for pay or bloodlust, he marched off with the local regiment. His absence left Thornhill strangely hushed. In his place came Silas Kendrick, a man of weaker hand and quieter cruelty. He enforced Catherine's rules, but with hesitation. Some said he was half afraid of the heritage room himself. Catherine cared little for overseers. They were tools as replaceable as livestock. Her eyes never lifted from her charts, her jars, her growing brood. Violet and Sarah, the darkest moment of these years was Violet's end. She had once been a mother of grace, her singing voice known in the quarters. But when Catherine paired her daughter Sarah with Elijah, the girl broke, frail, unwilling, dead by age 15. Violet's grief hollowed her. In 1862, after months of silence, she walked into the plantation pond one evening and never returned. Children whispered of her skirts floating like lilies. The water stilled and her body sank. The quarters called it despair. Catherine called it weakness. In her ledger she wrote coldly, "Violet, excised, her line is compromised," and in the heritage room, Sarah's name was crossed through in red ink. Miriam Grayson's shifting voice, Miriam Grayson, midwife and archivist, grew troubled in these years. Her handwriting faltered, her letters show unease. In a letter to her sister in Augusta, found decades later, water-stained and torn, she wrote, "The mistress believes she breeds nations. Yet all I see are graves. She says she is preserving strength, but I fear we preserve only horror. God forgive me, I have measured and marked children as if they were lambs at slaughter." Her loyalty frayed, but fear bound her still. She stayed, key in hand, opening the heritage room when Catherine summoned, watching more jars fill. Political tremors ignored while Fort Sumter burned in April 1861, and armies rose in gray and blue. Thornhill remained cloistered. Catherine rarely left her land. Supplies grew harder to procure, but she used her father's merchant ties in Augusta to secure what she needed: laudanum, ether, surgical steel. Neighbors drilled. Catherine drew charts. Soldiers marched. Catherine whispered lullabies of destiny to her brood. Let the world split, I will not, my bloodline will endure long after their flags rot. Such words were recorded by Jonathan Jr. years later when his conscience finally turned against her. Elenina's awakening amid these years. Elenina, the second born, grew restless. Unlike her elder brother, she did not comply in silence. She began exploring the estate's records, creeping into rooms her mother forbade. By 1862, she had stumbled upon fragments of Catherine's cipher, half understood but enough to grasp the scope of her mother's scheme. Her notes survive only in marginal scribbles in a hymn book. Mother speaks of destiny, but it is only cruelty dressed as science. She calls us chosen, I call us trapped. This was the seed of rebellion, still quiet but growing. A house darkening by 1862, Thornhill's halls had turned oppressive. Windows stayed shuttered. Corridors smelled of laudanum and old smoke. The children grew pale, disciplined, marked by Catherine's endless measuring. The enslaved moved like shadows, fearful but listening. The heritage room swelled with specimens, locks, jars, bones, a grotesque genealogy, a shrine to flesh, and outside the war thundered closer. Burke County sent its sons to battlefields far north. Refugees moved along the roads, yet Catherine believed her estate immune, but Thornhill was already cracking from within. By the close of 1862, the Thornhill estate was a paradox, isolated from the roar of civil war, yet steeped in its own internal conflict. Catherine pressed harder on her brood, convinced time was short. The enslaved counted their dead and whispered in the dark, and Elenina's doubts kindled into defiance. The storm was coming, and Thornhill could not escape it. The children's burden these pages, fragile and water-stained, bear testimony not of generals or battles, but of a smaller, darker war. 1863, when the South bled, Thornhill too bled, but from wounds of its own devising. Remember, these words are drawn from ledgers and whispers, from a hymn book scrawled by a frightened hand, and though the house is long fallen, its shadows still speak. Take heed and lean close. Catherine's defiance of history war devoured Georgia that year. Burke County heard news of Chickamauga and Vicksburg, of fields burned and sons slain. Neighbors dug trenches, stockpiled food, whispered of ruin. Yet within Thornhill, Catherine moved untouched, her gaze fixed not on the Confederacy's fall, but upon her diagrams. Let them march and kill. The republics of men are brittle, but flesh if tended well outlasts kingdoms. So she wrote in her journal, ciphered in looping hand, now cracked and faded. Her obsession pressed harder. Pairings were ordered not with ceremony but with command. Jonathan Jr. to Rachel, Samuel to Anna, Caroline marked for the next cycle, each union not of love but of arithmetic. Jonathan's quiet rebellion, Jonathan Jr. obeyed outwardly, but within him a conflict grew. Rachel, soft, voiced and resigned, looked at him with eyes that accused without a word. He shared her pain but could not protect her, not yet. In a margin of his father's old Bible, Jonathan scratched words so faint they nearly vanish today. Obedience is her idol, but idols topple. It was the first crack of rebellion. Elenina's awakening, unlike her brother, Elenina's defiance sharpened openly. She prowled her mother's chambers, stole fragments of notes, copied symbols into her hymn book. Night after night, she whispered over them, piecing meaning. By mid-1863, she had begun to decipher Catherine's system. She saw how her mother mapped lineage like a gardener maps grafts. She saw where Sarah, Ruth, and Margaret were crossed out. She saw locks of hair catalogued, jars of clotted milk labeled as if holy relics. And she wrote in her hymn book, a line underlined twice, "This is no family, it is an experiment." Grace's attempt that summer, Grace, a young woman swollen with child, fled the quarters under moonlight. Some say hope aided her, others claim she fled alone. She was caught within 2 days. Silas Kendrick, weak but obedient, bound her to the whipping post at Catherine's order. Catherine herself stood silent as lash fell upon flesh, her eyes not of anger but of cold calculation. When it ended, Grace was half conscious, her back flayed. Catherine noted only escape attempt, breeding line compromised, monitor infant if it survives. The quarters did not forget. Grace survived, but her spirit was broken. Her whispers became prayers muttered day and night for release. The Heritage Room expands in those months. The Heritage Room swelled to grotesque proportions, more jars, more locks of hair, charts upon charts, until the walls seemed papered with branches of flesh. Miriam Grayson's handwriting faltered in the ledgers, her hand shaking. She confessed in a letter never sent, "I feel the walls pressing in as if I too am pinned to her chart. God forgive me, but each entry I make feels like a grave dug in ink." She stayed, but her loyalty cracked. Rumors of freedom news crept even into Thornhill. Whispers of Lincoln's proclamation, of Union armies freeing the enslaved, of Sherman's march in Tennessee. Hope carried such rumors softly through the quarters. The day will come, chains will fall, the mistress cannot keep us bound forever. Children listened why, died, mothers hushed them in fear, yet the seed was planted. Catherine, sensing the shifting air, tightened her grip. She forbade gatherings after dusk, forbade him, singing, forbade even whispering in corners. Still, the rumors spread. The drowning memory that autumn violets drowning lingered as a scar. At the pond's edge, enslaved women left pebbles in quiet remembrance. They said her ghost sang under the reeds. One account written in 1902 by a former child of the quarters recalled, "When the frogs sang at night, we heard Violet among them. She sang for Sarah, she sang for us. It was warning and comfort both. The Heritage Room had its jars, but the quarters had their ghosts." Jonathan and Elenina unite late in 1863. Jonathan found Elenina copying their mother's cipher. At first he feared, then he understood. For the first time, brother and sister spoke plainly. "Jonathan, if she sees that, she'll kill you. Elenina, she already has in pieces, better to know than to rot blind." They swore in hushed voices to guard one another. Jonathan would endure outwardly, Elenina would unmask their mother's scheme. Hope, listening from shadows, nodded. A triangle of resistance began, silent but steady. Catherine's journal fragment, late 1863, Jonathan weakens. Elenina resists, but I shall bend them. A mother must bend her children as iron is bent, through fire, through weight. They are mine, their marrow, their wombs, their seed, mine. This passage, later recovered in a fragment of journal, shows Catherine's awareness of rebellion. Yet she did not see how deep the cracks had grown. A house at breaking point by year's end, Thornhill's halls trembled with tension. Catherine's chosen brood bore silent misery. The enslaved whispered rumors of armies drawing nearer. Grace lay broken, yet alive. Hope whispered courage. And in the East Wing, the Heritage Room swelled with jars, charts, relics of human lives catalogued like seeds in a vault. The storm outside, the war was closing, but the storm inside Thornhill was nearer and deadlier. By the close of 1863, Thornhill was no longer merely Catherine's estate. It was a crucible, her children torn between obedience and revolt, her enslaved whispering of freedom, her overseer too weak to hold order. Catherine's grip was strong, but history pressed from both within and without. The next year would see her empire collapse. The pact of shadows these last documents of 1864 bear the scent of fire. The ink smudges, the pages warped by heat, speak of a world about to be consumed. The Confederacy staggered toward death that year, but in Thornhill a darker covenant took shape, not of flags or generals, but of blood, bone, and the hand of a mother who would not release her grip. Sherman at the door by autumn, the roads of Burke County echoed with rumors of Union troops. Atlanta had burned, Savannah was threatened. Plantations fell silent as enslaved fled or were driven deeper inland. But Catherine Thornhill did not flee. She ordered shutters barred, food hoarded, silver buried. Thornhill became a fortress not against soldiers, but against the unraveling of her dominion. In her journal she wrote, "They shall not take what I have made. Better ashes than theft, better silence than dilution." A household under siege, the enslaved sensed the shifting winds. Hope's whispers turned sharper. Sherman's men are close. Freedom rides with them. The mistress cannot hold us long. Some packed secret bundles ready for the moment to flee. Others trembled, fearing reprisal if caught. Silas Kendrick, the broken overseer, muttered drunken prayers in his quarters. His loyalty wavered, his fear deepened. He clung to Catherine, yet recoiled from her more each day. And Grace, scarred from the whipping, sang lullabies of escape to her infant, songs carried like sparks through the quarters. Catherine's rituals deepen inside Thornhill's east wing. The heritage room became more than a gallery. Catherine lit candles before her charts, whispering over jars of hair and clotted milk. Some say she mixed drops of laudanum with wine, drinking it slowly, her eyes glazed with fervor. Elinina wrote in her hymnbook, "Mother kneels before her jars." She prays not to God but to herself. One night Jonathan Jr. spied her at the altar. She pressed a knife to her palm, let blood drip upon parchment, and whispered names: Sarah, Ruth, Margaret, Violet, as if calling them back. The house smelled of iron and candle smoke. The pact conceived late in 1008, 164, Catherine's journal shifts from calculation to prophecy. A passage, charred at the edges, survives. If fire comes, if armies trample these halls, I shall gather my blood to me. They will not leave me, nor I them. Flesh shall be bound in the quiet sleep, laudanum enough, sweet and clean, and we shall cross together. It was her plan, a mother's suicide pact. She would rather see her children dead at her side than free in a ruined South. Jonathan and Elinina discover the truth. Elinina, through her cipher work, uncovered the passage first. She showed it to Jonathan under moonlight in the attic. His hands trembled as he read. Jonathan, she means to kill us. Elinina, not kill, bind. In her mind it is love. Jonathan, then we must choose obedience or freedom. They swore then to resist, not for themselves only, but for Rachel, Anna, Caroline, and the enslaved marked for pairing. Hope overheard and pressed their hands. When the hour comes, we must move like shadows. God sends freedom on the wind. The overseer breaks Selah's. Kendrick grew unstable. Witness accounts say he staggered through halls, muttering Catherine's orders aloud, as if rehearsing them for ghosts. One night, half drunk, he confessed to Jonathan, "She means poison, boy, laudanum enough to fell a horse, says it'll be peace, but peace smells of graves." Jonathan pressed him for details. Selah's wept, swore silence, and disappeared into drink. By December he vanished altogether. Some say fled with deserters. Others say Catherine silenced him. His body was never found. The night of the first attempt, one evening, Catherine gathered her children, Jonathan, Elinina, Samuel, and Caroline, into the candlelit dining hall. Wine cups stood ready. Catherine's voice was honeyed, almost gentle. "Children, the world outside is broken, but here we are whole. Drink with me, and we shall never be parted." Jonathan's hand shook as he raised the cup. He saw the faint oily sheen, the bitter scent beneath the wine. Elinina knocked her own cup aside, spilling it across the tablecloth. "No, mother." The moment froze. Catherine's eyes hardened. Jonathan set his cup down untouched. Caroline wept softly. Samuel stared blankly, paralyzed by fear. Catherine rose, trembling with fury. "Ungrateful spawn, I give you eternity, and you spit upon it." She swept the cups to the floor. The wine hissed as it soaked into the boards. That night, Catherine retreated to the heritage room, slamming the doors. Inside, she screamed prayers until dawn. The enslaved prepare word of the poisoned wine reached the quarters through hope. Panic rippled, mothers clutched children, men whispered of rushing the house, of seizing freedom before death claimed them all. But Catherine's grip still lingered, her punishments remembered. None yet dared. Still, they watched the roads. When the Union Army came, they would run. Catherine's madness peaks in the final weeks of 1864. Catherine ceased to bathe, ceased to eat save for wine and laudanum. Her journals scrawl into madness. They betray me. My own seed conspires. Yet they are mine. Their marrow mine, their blood mine. If they flee, I shall follow. If they breathe, it is by my hand. She began sleeping in the heritage room, clutching jars of hair to her breast as if they were infants. Jonathan wrote in his father's Bible, "She rots before us, yet her shadow grows larger." The looming fire by December, the sound of war thundered closer. Columns of smoke marked the horizon. Fugitives whispered of Sherman's soldiers cutting through the state like a blade. The enslaved could hear cannon, fire faint on still nights. Hope told them, "The Lord's army draws near, hold fast, the mistress cannot bind the wind." Yet Catherine only smiled when told of armies. "Let them burn, Thornhill will endure in my flesh, I shall plant my line in the ashes." The closing of the year, the last entry of 1864 in Miriam Grayson's ledger, is faint, hurried, and almost illegible. She prepares for the sleep again. "Tonight, tomorrow, I do not know. The children whisper rebellion, the quarters whisper freedom, and I, God forgive me, I can do nothing but record. The Lord have mercy when the hour comes." By the end of 1864, Thornhill stood like a powder keg. Catherine sharpened her pact of death. Her children gathered courage to resist, and the enslaved community trembled on the edge of flight. Sherman's march neared. The next year would see Thornhill consumed. The House of Binding from January 1865, the Thornhill records thin to tatters. Some pages are smeared with soot, others warped with water. What remains is fragmentary, fevered, yet within those fragments lies the moment when Catherine Thornhill reached for eternity and grasped only ruin. The march approaches. By early 1865, Union cavalry skirmished along the Savannah River. Smoke rose from plantations to the north. Families fled inland, leaving manors hollow and silent. But Thornhill did not empty. Catherine Thornhill still commanded her children and the enslaved to remain. She told them, "We are the root, roots do not run, roots endure." Her voice was iron, though her body wasted from laudanum and wine. Fear in the quarters at night, the enslaved gathered in the shadows of the smokehouse. Hope, scarred and strong, told them the news, "Sherman's bluecoats are days away. I have seen their scouts upon the road. When they come, we go." Grace rocked her infant against her shoulder, humming low. Anna whispered of routes through the cane brakes. Men sharpened hidden knives, though they feared the reprisal if discovered. Some urged immediate escape. Others, cowed by memory of Catherine's wrath, hesitated. But all knew the time was nearly come. Catherine's preparations, Catherine's journal in January 1008. 165 becomes almost illegible, a scrawl across margins. One passage, preserved by the fire's singe, reads, "The march is fire, and fire cleanses. I must gather them, all my children, into one body. They will not leave me. Their breath is mine. Their marrow is mine. Laudanum waits." She gathered bottles of tincture, measured powders into porcelain cups. Miriam Grayson still half enslaved by loyalty and half broken by fear, watched and recorded in furtive notes. She mixes sleep into wine again. This time she will not fail. The gathering on a night when cannon fire echoed faint from the horizon. Catherine summoned the household to the dining hall. The candles burned low, curtains drawn. Before each child sat a cup. Before Jonathan, Rachel sat too, pale with dread. Even Silas Kendrick, returned ragged and trembling after weeks gone, was forced into a chair. Catherine's words were measured, almost tender. "The world outside burns, but we, my children, will not burn. We will cross together into a place beyond armies, drink, and be free of this mortal war." Her hand trembled as she raised her own cup. Resistance. Jonathan's gaze met Elenina's across the table. Neither moved to drink. Rachel clutched her hands in her lap, whispering a prayer too faint to hear. Then Hope's voice rang suddenly from the hall, carrying from the doorway, "Do not drink, children." The enslaved had gathered. Hope, Grace, Anna, and others. They stood in the doorway, trembling but resolute. Catherine froze, cup at her lips, her eyes blazed out. "This is not your covenant." But Jonathan rose. "Mother, no more. We are not your vessels." He knocked his cup to the floor. Elenina followed, sweeping hers aside. Rachel did the same, the bitter liquid soaking the boards. Catherine shrieked, the sound more beast than human. The breaking of Silas Kendrick, shaking, finally spoke. "Enough, madam. Let them live. Let us all live." He tried to rise, but Catherine turned on him with a fury. Some say she snatched a knife from the table and struck him across the cheek, drawing blood. Silas reeled back, howling. This moment shattered the room. Children screamed, servants surged. The uprising Hope shouted, "Now to the doors, run." In a storm of motion, enslaved and children scattered from the dining hall. Grace clutched her infant. Anna pulled Caroline by the wrist. Jonathan dragged Rachel through the corridor. Catherine lunged after them, overturning chairs, her skirts dragging through the spilled wine. She screamed names, Jonathan, Elenina, mine, 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 as though her voice could bind them in chains. The enslaved burst open the back door into the night, the first free breath of air sharp and cold. Behind them, Catherine's howl shook the halls, fire in the chaos, candles overturned, curtains caught, the west hall flamed. Some later, said Catherine herself in frenzy, lit the draperies with a taper, determined that if she could not bind her children, she would burn the house around them. The blaze spread fast, pine beams roared like kindling. Outside, fugitives gathered in the field, watching as the roof of Thornhill lit against the night sky. The last sight of Catherine testimony diverges on Catherine's end. Some say she perished in the flames, still clutching jars of hair from the heritage room. Others claim she was seen upon the balcony, arms outstretched, calling her children to return to her fire. Jonathan wrote later in his father's Bible margin, "She would rather burn with us than lose us. I chose the night air." The arrival of Union troops by dawn, Union cavalry appeared upon the road. They found Thornhill half in ashes, the enslaved huddled in the fields, the children weeping. Officers took brief account, noted the ruin, and pressed on. Freedom arrived not with fanfare, but with smoke and silence. The record ends. Miriam Grayson's final ledger entry, smudged with soot, reads, "It is finished, the mistress is gone, the house is gone, what remains is only the ash and the children who saw too much." By early 1865, Catherine Thornhill's reign collapsed in fire. The enslaved seized freedom. The children escaped her poisoned covenant, and Thornhill itself became a pyre. Yet the true horror was not the burning of a house, but the legacy left smoldering in blood and memory. The ashes that speak the Thornhill estate ended in fire, yet its silence proved no end. The ruin smoldered, and from that smoke came whispers carried into ledgers, Bibles, and memory. What follows is no triumphal tale of liberation, but the fractured accounts of survivors who walked away with ash in their lungs and Catherine Thornhill's shadow still clinging to their skin. The ruins, when the fires cooled, Thornhill was a blackened shell. Chimneys jutted like broken teeth against the sky. Charred beams collapsed upon themselves. In the yard, fragments of porcelain lay scattered among footprints and hoof marks left by Union cavalry. The enslaved gathered in hushed knots, unsure whether to weep or rejoice. Freedom had come, but it came with hunger, uncertainty, and the weight of memories they could not shake. A Union lieutenant wrote in his pocket diary, March 1865, arrived at Thornhill, place destroyed by fire, found 20 odd Negroes in the field, some with infants, mistress reported deceased, children unaccounted for at first, later found among group, strange house, locals whisper she was not right in the mind. Jonathan's account, Jonathan Thornhill Jr., scarcely 16, bore the look of one twice his age. His skin still smelled of smoke, his eyes did not lift from the ground. In the margin of his father's Bible, now warped by heat, he wrote, "The house is gone, yet her voice follows me. In dreams she calls me to drink. I wake with the taste of bitterness on my tongue." He lingered near the ruins longer than the others, as if some part of him still felt bound to Catherine. Elenina had to pull him away, whispering, "She cannot reach you now." But Jonathan only answered, "Can she not?" Elenina's resolve, Elenina, hardened by her discoveries, grew into a quiet leader among the orphans. She guided her sisters Margaret and Abigail, comforted Rachel, and stood often with hope. Where Jonathan faltered in Catherine's shadow, Elenina pushed forward, determined to write the truth into memory. In her hymn book she scribbled by candlelight, "We are free in body, yet the chain is in the marrow. Our mother's hand is gone, but her mark runs red through us. May God turn rot into root." The enslaved scatter with the Union army passing quickly onward. The freed people faced a cruel reality. Emancipation left them with no land, no food, no shelter beyond the burnt husk of Thornhill. Some left immediately, joining refugee columns moving toward Savannah. Others lingered, hoping to salvage tools or seed. Grace, her infant strapped to her back, joined a caravan of freedwomen bound for Augusta. She carried nothing from Thornhill but a small brass thimble, her only keepsake of her mother, long dead. Anna and her brother slipped away at night, following Union troops, their path lost to record. Hope, however, remained near Burke County. She refused to let Catherine's memory be buried. She told those who would listen, "We must speak what she did. If we bury the truth, it will grow again." Her words planted seeds of oral history that endured long after Thornhill's stones cooled. The search for Catherine, the body of Catherine Thornhill, was never formally recovered. Union soldiers claimed no corpse was found in the ruins. Some believed she perished in the fire, clutching her relics. Others whispered she fled into the woods, mad and burned, seen later wandering the river roads. One soldier's note suggests an uncanny sighting. Local Negro woman claims she saw a white lady in ashes walking barefoot along Ogeechee Creek, muttering of her children, could not verify. The uncertainty deepened the myth. Catherine's survival, or spectral persistence, became a whispered terror. Salvaged artifacts, though much burned, some of Catherine's relics endured. A Union officer requisitioning Thornhill discovered sealed trunks beneath stone in the cellar. Inside, journals bound in scorched leather, a set of obstetric forceps, rusted but intact, glass jars of hair and preserved tissue, miraculously unbroken, charts and genealogical tables inked with red symbols. Stamped later in War Department records, confiscated articles, property of U.S. Army Medical Bureau 1865. These items disappeared into Washington archives, surfacing only in redacted reports decades later. The fracturing of the children Jonathan and Rachel remained together uneasily. Their enforced pairing by Catherine left a scar neither could erase. Witnesses noted their silence, the way Jonathan's hand twitched as if clutching a cup even when none was near. Rachel confided once to Elinina, "I hear her voice at night. She says I am still bound." Elinina urged her to keep walking, to sing, to write, but Rachel grew pale, withdrawing deeper into herself. Abigail and Margaret clung to Elinina, their faces shadowed by what they had seen. They too bore the knowledge that their mother's journals named them not as children but as vessels. The spread of whispers in Burke County, the Thornhill fire became legend almost immediately. Neighbors spoke of Catherine's mad science, of her breeding of children like cattle. Ministers thundered against her as a Jezebel, while former Confederates dismissed the story as Union propaganda. But in the freed people's quarters, the story was told differently. Catherine had been a witch of flesh and blood, and the fire was God's justice. Yet they warned their children that her blood still walked in Jonathan, in Elinina, in Rachel. Thus the Thornhill name carried both stigma and fear. Miriam Grayson's final entry, Miriam, once Catherine's handmaiden, lived on in Augusta, where she worked as a laundress. She carried with her a single charred notebook, the partial ledger of births, deaths, and Catherine's commands. In its last page, dated April 1865, she wrote, "The house is gone, but not her seed. They carry her in the bone. What grows from such seed, God alone knows. My duty is ended. I pray he forgives me." She died within the year, her notebook later catalogued in a parish archive, stamped in red ink, restricted access 1872. A legacy in ashes by the war's end, Thornhill no longer stood. Yet Catherine's shadow survived in three ways: in blood through her children, fractured but living, carrying the taint of her obsession; in record through the journals, artifacts, and ledgers seized, scattered into archives; in memory through Hope's oral accounts and freed people's whispered warnings. And so, while the South reeled in Reconstruction, Catherine Thornhill's ghost walked in silence, not in stone, but in marrow, in rumor, and in the brittle pages of hidden collections. Thornhill was ash, yet its story was not ended. Survivors carried it outward, in bodies, in memory, in secret archives. Catherine's grip loosened, but the question remained, had it truly broken, or merely shifted into subtler forms? The silence of record's freedom had come, yet Catherine's ghost was not so easily dismissed. The ruin at Thornhill might have collapsed into weeds and timber, but her name survived in the cracks of paper, in hushed recollections, and in the bloodlines of those who never chose to bear her legacy. What follows are the fragments scattered across years of silence. Records half. burned, testimonies unsworn, the kind of history that hides in courthouse basements until some unlucky researcher opens the wrong box. Jonathan's drift. Jonathan Thornhill wandered west in the 1870s, Texas, Arkansas, then Oklahoma Territory. He traveled under assumed names, changing them as easily as one might change coats, but his notebooks betrayed him. Soldiers who passed through his camp remembered a strange young man scribbling endlessly in miniature script, filling entire pages with the same sentence: "I did not choose this, I did not choose this, I did not choose this." When Jonathan died in 1891, those notebooks were found beside him, wrapped in oilcloth. They passed from sheriff to local judge, then into the archives of a county courthouse, where they remain stamped simply, unclaimed, personal effects. The handwriting matches Catherine's ledgers with unsettling precision. Eleanor's silence. Elenina stayed longer in Georgia. She worked as a seamstress in Savannah, married a carpenter named William Foster, but bore no children. Neighbors noted her pale green eyes and said little else. Her hymn book survives in a church collection. In its margins, she wrote a single cryptic phrase across several psalms: "The Lord frees the captive, but he does not free the marrow." When she died in 1903, her obituary made no mention of Thornhill, yet the black community in Savannah remembered. That was the girl who walked away from the fire. Rachel's vanishing. Rachel never adjusted to freedom. She drifted between households, unable to settle. In 1872, she disappeared entirely from the record. A single rumor places her in New Orleans, singing in a riverfront tavern. Another insists she drowned herself in the Ogeechee. No grave bears her name. Some whispered she still carried Catherine's voice, whispering commands when the night was deep. The children in the basement, perhaps the most haunting fragment of the Thornhill story, came from the 23 children discovered locked in the plantation basement when Union troops arrived. Federal officers noted their existence but lost track of them almost immediately. A ledger in the Freedmen's Bureau, Augusta, 1865, lists 23 dependents, probable kin of Thornhill estate, placed among freed families. After that, the entries scatter. Yet certain names resurface in genealogical records decades later. A carpenter in Charleston with pale green eyes, a schoolteacher in Birmingham with hair the color of rust, a woman in Macon whose children were noted for oddly sharp cheekbones. If they bore Catherine's legacy, none of them knew it. Or if they did, they never admitted it aloud. The well discovery in 1871, a well. Driller broke into a collapsed cistern near the ruins of Thornhill. Inside lay the skeleton of a woman in her 30s or 40s, skull crushed by blunt force. A corroded locket near the remains contained 2 portraits, a stern man and a boy with pale eyes. The coroner's notes are clinical: cause of death, fracture of occipital bone, likely 6-10 years prior. The county listed her only as unknown female, former Thornhill property. But in Burke County's black community, no one doubted. They said the devil, mistress, had been dragged down into the dark, left for the earth to hold. The suppressed letter in 1923, a historian sifting through courthouse papers uncovered a letter written by Union Captain Samuel Reynolds in 1865. It described the confiscated journals, jars of specimens, and testimonies of breeding experiments. Reynolds admitted the witnesses would not speak plainly, but their silence said enough. Whatever justice befell the woman Thornhill, I chose not to disturb it. My men will report nothing further. The letter was quietly refiled, marked in red pencil, sensitive, do not publish. It remained unknown until a graduate student uncovered it again in 1954. Her dissertation notes, unpublished but archived, remark, "The material resembles early eugenics discourse, but its source, an enslaver rather than a scientific society, makes it more grotesque. The silence around Thornhill is intentional. This is a history nobody wishes to claim." Hope's legacy. Hope, who remained near Burke County after emancipation, became a matriarch of oral memory. Her children and grandchildren grew up hearing the story not as history but as warning. Her granddaughter, writing in 1902, recalled, the night the devil mistress disappeared and nobody mourned her. These words appeared in a slim, unpublished memoir kept in a church chest, discovered only in the 1970s. Medical echoes the seized artifacts, Catherine's journals, instruments, and specimens, surfaced in Washington's Army Medical Museum in the late 19th century. Catalog cards list anomalous obstetric forceps, southern provenance, hair samples from experimental breeding, Georgia. Ledgers of Hereditary Record 1008, 148-1008, 164. By 1900, these entries were struck through in ink, transferred restricted collection. Their trail vanishes into private boxes, likely destroyed, or perhaps still sealed in federal basements. Yet one can trace their influence in uncanny ways. Early American eugenicists in the 1910 spoke of self-perpetuating stocks and hereditary chains, with language disturbingly similar to Catherine's journals. Did some of them read her words, or did the logic of cruelty simply repeat itself? The weight of silence by the early 20th century, Thornhill was scrubbed from Burke County's official histories. No marker, no plaque, no book spoke of the plantation. Its foundation lay under vines, its fields sold to timber, yet silence itself became the record. Descendants of freed people whispered the story in kitchens and churches in fragments. She bred her own. They ended her in the dark. Her blood still walks. Meanwhile, in genealogical circles, faint traces of green-eyed families in Georgia carried a stigma, unspoken but deeply felt. Toward the present, by the time the graduate student in 1954 tried to piece the story together, she found nothing but closed doors. Elderly residents shook their heads, saying only, "Some things happened that needed to happen, that's all." Her notes end with a chilling line, "I am beginning to think the silence is not absence but protection." Thus Catherine Thornhill's name nearly vanished, not through accident, but through deliberate suppression. The freed people chose silence to protect their own. The federal officers chose silence to avoid scandal. And the descendants chose silence because who would want to carry her mark? Yet silence is never perfect. It leaves cracks, and through those cracks, fragments seep forward, waiting for someone to gather them. The archivist's warning you have followed thus far. 10 parts stitched together from ledgers, marginalia, suppressed files, and the bitter breath of memory. Thornhill Plantation stands no more. Its beams rot under kudzu, its name excised from county histories. And yet the past refuses to lie still. Tonight, in this final descent, we assemble what remains. Not to close the matter, for history of this nature is never closed, but to place it, trembling, into your hands. The vanished house by the 1970s, nothing recognizable stood where Thornhill had once spread its fields. Survey maps labeled the tract simply private timberland. A few stone foundations jutted from vines. A handful of bricks sank into earth. Yet locals refused to camp there. Hunters reported hearing children crying beneath the soil. Fishermen swore the creek near the ruins ran redder after heavy rains. In 1983, a logging crew struck iron at the site of the old cellar. They pulled up a rusted door hinge, then a bent length of chain. Work stopped. A foreman phoned the county to report potential human remains. The sheriff filed a single-page report, then locked it away. When questioned years later, he muttered, "Some history, boy, don't need digging up." The students returned that same year. The graduate student who had uncovered Captain Reynolds's suppressed letter returned to Burke County. She was older now, tenured, and determined to publish. Her diary, deposited posthumously in 2001, records the chilling resistance she met. A courthouse clerk who shut the file drawer with trembling hands. "Not for you, not for anyone." A pastor who warned, "The story ain't written down because it's still alive." A woman in her 90s who spat on the floor when the name Thornhill was spoken. The historian left within weeks. Her last entry reads, "I no longer believe the silence conceals nothing. I believe it conceals everything." DNA, 1990s. In the late 20th century, genealogy turned to science. DNA kits promised family answers, roots, clarity. Yet in Burke County, several African American families with no known relation discovered unusual genetic clusters traced back to a shared European maternal source. In the mid-19th century, the match pointed not to Ireland, Scotland, or England, but to Georgia, to Burke County. Local genealogists, discreet and careful, whispered a single possibility, Catherine, and yet the samples were quietly withdrawn from public databases. Relatives cited privacy concerns, but others whispered they don't want her name in their blood. The redacted box in 2004, a FOIA request, revealed a sealed box in the National Archives labeled Obstetric Implements, Georgia, 1860s, specimens, hair/teeth restricted. Ledger Vol. Roman II breeding records confiscated 1865. The request was denied. The archivist's margin note, however, leaked. Contents fragile. Access denied under exemption for personal privacy and cultural sensitivity. Box to remain sealed until 2100. Thus Catherine's hand still rests within federal walls, waiting, silent, enduring. Folklore in fragments even stripped from official record, her story bled into folklore. In Burke County's rural churches, old hymns were altered with warnings: bind the child, lest the mistress call. Cover the eyes, lest the green pass through. In whispered tales told to children, she was no longer Catherine Thornhill, planter's wife and experimenter. She became the bone midwife, a figure who came in dreams to pry newborns from mother's arms. And yet the details matched too closely: the iron forceps, the hair of green-eyed infants, the cellars and jars. Fiction may be safer to tell than truth. The archivists lament reading through this archive. I confess a disquiet beyond professional distance. Too many gaps remain deliberate, too many silences preserved with care. What history attempts to hide often carries the most weight. Did Catherine die by blunt force in that cistern? Did her own captives drag her into the dark? Or did she, like Jonathan, wander into other lands under false names, seeding her record in whispers and half-seen faces? We do not know, we may never know, but we cannot say she is gone. Because, in the marrow of certain families, in the sealed boxes of federal repositories, and in the shadows of forgotten churches, her name endures, property of the unpublished record. Do not circulate without clearance.